You know, Joe Biden gave them $350 billion. You know what I gave them? Nothing. I gave them, well, I did give them javelins at the beginning and knocked out a hell of a lot of attacks. But and Obama gave sheets. Remember, Obama gave sheets and I gave javelins. But no, we have a great situation going over there, except for one problem. You got a lot of people dying, and I want to see that stop. So you have mostly Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers. Last month, 27,000 soldiers died, mostly soldiers. A few people from the dropping of a missile in the middle of Kiev or wherever, which is a terrible thing, but mostly soldiers. 27,000 soldiers died last month. That's what I want to see stopped. We, as you know, we now sell equipment to NATO at full price, and NATO takes that equipment and probably gives it to Ukraine. I guess they could give it to others too, but for the most part, give it to Ukraine. And they're working with Ukraine in terms of distribution of equipment, missiles, etc. But we aren't spending money. What we are doing is spending time on a humane basis. We want to see if we can stop the killing of 27. It would have never happened. This war would have never happened if the election weren't rigged. If I were president, this war.
You just watched Donald Trump stand before cameras and engage in one of the most obscene performances of moral inversion that this already nightmarish era has produced, a spectacular display of cynical revisionism that would make George Orwell weep and Hannah Arendt rise from her grave to write another volume on the banality of evil made manifest in a spray-tan demagogue droning on about javelins versus sheets, while thousands upon thousands of human beings are being pulverized into the blood-soaked earth of Ukraine. This is not merely disinformation, it is the consecration of a death cult disguised as peacemaking, and you need to understand precisely what depths of depravity we are witnessing, because Trump has repeatedly cited casualty numbers without evidence to back up his statements, numbers that independent analysts say have no basis in reality, while he positions himself as the great humanitarian arbiter of a conflict that would never have happened if only the election weren't rigged, and he had remained in power to bestow his benevolent protection upon Ukraine, and presumably the entire world which cannot function without his singular genius. Let me tell you what is happening here, because this is where things get absolutely incendiary, and you need to feel the full weight of this corruption pressing down on your conscience. President Volodymyr Zelensky said on February 16 that over 46,000 Ukrainian soldiers had died on the battlefield since February 2022, a staggering and heartbreaking figure that represents real human beings with families and futures obliterated by Russian aggression. Yet Trump casually throws around numbers like 27,000 soldiers dying in a single month, a claim so wildly disconnected from verified reporting that it borders on psychological warfare against the truth itself, because when the latest estimates suggest that under 2,000 soldiers are killed on average per week on both sides, Trump inflating monthly death tolls to apocalyptic proportions serves one purpose and one purpose only, which is to create a sense of urgency so overwhelming that Ukraine must capitulate to whatever draconian terms he and his circle of sycophants have negotiated with Vladimir Putin in backroom dealings that reek of corruption and compromise. And here comes the absolutely sickening part that should make your blood boil with righteous fury. The part where Trump dismisses civilian casualties with a wave of his hand, and that characteristic sociopathic nonchalance, saying a few people from the dropping of a missile in the middle of Kiev or wherever, which is a terrible thing, but mostly soldiers, as if civilian deaths are some negligible footnote in his grand narrative of peacemaking prowess. Let me be devastatingly clear about what this rhetorical minimization accomplishes, because the United Nations verified 39,081 civilian casualties during Russia's invasion as of October 31, 2024, with the civilian death toll exceeding 12,100. According to UN statistics, 13,134 civilian deaths have been recorded in Ukraine, with more than 31,867 Ukrainians recorded as wounded, but Trump reduces this incomprehensible suffering to a few people, because in his transactional worldview, human beings are merely abstractions, statistics to be manipulated in service of whatever narrative burnishes his reputation as the great dealmaker, who alone can end wars that he claims would never have started, if only he had been president, which brings us to the most pernicious lie embedded in this entire performance. This war would have never happened if the election weren't rigged. If I were president, this war would have never happened. And there it is, the apotheosis of Trumpian mythology, the belief system that his MAGA acolytes have internalized so completely that they will watch him say these words and nod along in fervent agreement, while ignoring the catastrophic reality that Trump's first administration laid the groundwork for Putin's invasion by weakening NATO alliances, withholding military aid to Ukraine in an extortion scheme that got him impeached, and consistently genuflecting before Putin in ways that telegraphed American indifference to Ukrainian sovereignty. The notion that Putin would have been deterred by Trump's presence in the White House is so laughably ahistorical that it requires willful amnesia about Trump's entire record of appeasing authoritarian strongmen, but this is precisely the gaslighting that authoritarians excel at, rewriting history in real time while their supporters cheer and progressives are left screaming into the void about objective reality. Now pay very close attention, because this is where the current geopolitical catastrophe reaches its crescendo and reveals the true horror of what Trump is orchestrating with the full backing of the American right wing. Trump's 28-point plan for peace in Ukraine would force Kyiv to give up additional territory in the east, cap the size of its military, and agree it will never join NATO. And despite the plan including proposals Ukraine has repeatedly rejected, the U.S. side is pushing Ukraine to make a deal on an aggressive timeline, which means Trump is not mediating peace. He is facilitating Ukrainian surrender to Russian imperialism. This framework does not offer a genuine path to lasting peace, but instead demands the surrender and capitulation of Ukraine to Russian aggression, rewarding Russia's unprovoked invasion, illegal seizure of Ukrainian territory, and pressuring Ukraine to limit its defense capabilities and abandon its aspirations for NATO membership. Do you understand what this means? Do you grasp the implications of the American president pressuring a democratic nation under brutal invasion to permanently cede territory to an autocratic aggressor? This is not diplomacy. This is extortion dressed up in the language of pragmatism. Republican Representative Don Bacon, who says he considered resigning from Congress in protest over the recently proposed peace plan, commented that the president's appeasement plan to Russia is forcing our hand, which tells you everything about how nakedly pro-Russian this proposal actually is, when even Trump's own party members are using the word appeasement with all of its devastating historical connotations. But here is where things become even more sinister, and you need to brace yourself for this, because it implicates not just Trump, but the entire right-wing apparatus that has enabled him. Trump's new national security strategy claims that economic stagnation in Europe is eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure, suggesting that Europe is being enfeebled by its immigration policies, declining birth rates, censorship of free speech and suppression of political opposition, and loss of national identities and self-confidence, warning that should present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognizable in 20 years or less, and questioning whether certain European countries will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable allies. This is white nationalist Great Replacement theory, packaged as official American foreign policy doctrine. This is Steve Bannon's fever dreams given institutional legitimacy. The Kremlin has praised this new national security strategy, with spokesperson Dmitry Peskov saying that the changes correspond in many ways to our vision, welcoming language about ending the perception of the NATO military alliance as a perpetually expanding alliance, which means Putin is literally celebrating Trump's foreign policy because it advances Russian strategic objectives while undermining democratic solidarity. Think about what is happening here in the broader historical arc, because this moment demands that we situate Trump's Ukraine stance within the century-long struggle between democratic liberalism and authoritarian fascism. When Trump claims that Biden gave them $350 billion while contrasting this with his own supposed restraint, he is deliberately obscuring the fact that since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, the Biden administration has committed more than $65 billion in support to Ukraine, and has enabled Ukraine to resist total conquest and maintain its democratic institutions against a vastly larger military force bent on genocidal erasure of Ukrainian national identity. Trump frames this aid as wasteful profligacy, when it represents the most fundamental commitment to the international order that has prevented great power wars since 1945, but of course Trump has never cared about international norms or democratic values. He cares about transactional relationships with authoritarian rulers who flatter his ego and potentially hold compromising information about his business dealings. And this brings us to perhaps the most chilling aspect of Trump's performance in this clip, which is his attempt to position himself as the peace candidate, the humanitarian voice of reason who simply wants to see the killing stop, when every single action he is taking accelerates Ukrainian suffering by pressuring Kyiv to accept terms that would guarantee future Russian aggression. The 28-point plan puts forward the establishment of a so-called peace council, led by President Donald Trump to oversee compliance, an arrangement utterly unacceptable to Putin, as it places Trump in the position of supervising the Russian leader's actions, because Putin is waging war to prove he has an equal right to shape global decisions alongside the U.S. president and other world leaders, fighting for imagined respect and a status of equality or primacy among global actors, and in this worldview, putting anyone above himself, especially someone as unpredictable as Trump, would be humiliating and a signal of weakness, which means even Trump's own peace plan is likely to be rejected by Russia because it doesn't go far enough in legitimizing Putin's imperial ambitions. So let me be absolutely crystal clear about what we are witnessing, because the stakes could not be higher, and the moral dimensions could not be more stark. Trump is exploiting human suffering to advance a narrative of American disengagement from collective security. He is inflating casualty figures to manufacture consent for Ukrainian capitulation. He is minimizing civilian deaths to make Russian war crimes seem like unfortunate but acceptable collateral damage, and he is claiming that his presence in the White House would have magically prevented this war, when his entire first term telegraphed to Putin that America under Trump would not seriously contest Russian aggression. This is not merely incompetence or ignorance, this is active collaboration with authoritarian power dressed up in the performative language of peacemaking, and it represents an existential threat not just to Ukraine, but to the entire post-World War II liberal democratic order that has, for all its profound flaws and hypocrisies, prevented the kind of great power conflicts that defined the first half of the 20th century. Now I want you to understand the domestic political implications, because Trump's Ukraine stance is inextricable from his broader fascist project of undermining democratic norms and institutions. When he claims this war would have never happened if the election weren't rigged, he is simultaneously doing three things that compound each other in toxic synergy. First, he is perpetuating the big lie about the 2020 election that culminated in the January 6th insurrection and continues to poison American democracy. Second, he is creating an alternative reality where his leadership possesses quasi-magical properties that can prevent wars through sheer force of personality, rather than through multilateral cooperation and credible deterrence. And third, he is laying the groundwork for future claims that any foreign policy disasters under Democratic leadership could have been prevented if only Trump were in power, which feeds into the authoritarian personality cult that the Republican Party has become. The progressive movement needs to understand with absolute clarity that Trump's position on Ukraine is not some isolated foreign policy disagreement that we can agree to disagree about while focusing on domestic priorities. A new U.S. attempt to broker peace has sparked accusations of echoing key Kremlin demands, provoking a particularly strong reaction from some of Trump's colleagues within the Republican Party. Fresh polling from the right-leaning Vandenberg coalition found that only 16% of Trump voters agree with the proposal that Ukraine should surrender territory to the Kremlin, while 76% support sanctioning Russia, which means there is actually significant potential for a coalition against Trump's appeasement policies if progressives can effectively articulate why Ukrainian sovereignty matters for global justice and democratic solidarity. But here is where the progressive critique needs to be sophisticated and avoid the traps that the center-left has fallen into, because we cannot simply wave the flag and cheer for unlimited military spending in service of American hegemony. The reason we must support Ukrainian resistance is not because America has some benevolent right to police the world, but because the principle of national self-determination and the prohibition against wars of territorial conquest are foundational to any vision of international justice that progressive politics claims to uphold. When Russia invades Ukraine to erase its national identity and absorb its territory into a revanchist empire, when Putin murders dissidents with radioactive poison and imprisons opposition leaders and bombs children's hospitals, we are witnessing fascism in its purest form, and any progressive politics worth the name must stand in absolute opposition to fascism, regardless of whether the fascist leader happens to be in conflict with American power. This is not about defending NATO expansion or American militarism. This is about recognizing that Ukrainian people have the right to determine their own future without being subjected to genocidal violence by a neighboring autocracy, and when Trump minimizes their suffering while inflating casualty figures to pressure them into surrender, he is engaged in a moral atrocity that should be condemned by anyone who claims to care about human rights or democratic values. The fact that Trump's national security strategy cast the U.S. not as a NATO ally to Europe, but a mediator to mitigate the risk of conflict between Russia and European states, slamming European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war perched in unstable minority governments, where popular desire for peace is allegedly trampled by censorship and suppression of democracy, reveals how thoroughly Trump has adopted Putin's framing of the conflict, treating Russian imperialism and Ukrainian self-defense as morally equivalent positions that require American mediation, rather than recognizing the fundamental asymmetry between aggressor and victim. And we have not even fully reckoned with Trump's staggering dishonesty about military aid, because when he claims "I gave them javelins," while Obama gave sheets, he is deliberately obscuring the fact that his administration withheld congressionally appropriated military aid to Ukraine in 2019, specifically to extort Zelensky into announcing investigations of Hunter Biden, an abuse of power so flagrant that he was impeached for it, though of course Senate Republicans refused to convict because the Republican Party has completely abandoned any pretense of constitutional accountability. The javelins he brags about providing came with conditions that they not be used in the active combat zone in eastern Ukraine where they were most needed, rendering them largely symbolic. But Trump constructs this mythology where he was Ukraine's true defender, while Biden's massive aid packages are somehow wasteful or corrupting, when the reality is that Biden directed his administration to continue surging assistance to Ukraine as quickly as possible, drawing down older U.S. equipment for Ukraine, rapidly delivering it to the battlefield, and then revitalizing the U.S. defense industrial base to modernize and replenish stockpiles with new weapons, with the Department of Defense in the process of delivering hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds, thousands of rockets, and hundreds of armored vehicles to strengthen Ukraine's hand. Now let me bring this to the absolutely infuriating conclusion, because I need you to feel the full moral weight of what Trump is doing when he blames the rigged election for Ukraine's bloodbath. He is telling Ukrainian people that their suffering is not the result of Putin's imperialist aggression, not the consequence of Russian fascism and genocidal ideology, but rather the fault of American Democrats who allegedly stole an election, which means in Trump's deranged cosmology the real villains are not the Russian soldiers raping and murdering Ukrainian civilians, but rather the Americans who voted against him in 2020, and the election officials who certified those votes, and the journalists who reported accurately on the election, and the judges who dismissed his frivolous lawsuits. This is victim blaming on a geopolitical scale. This is moral obscenity masquerading as political analysis, and it is precisely the kind of reality-distorting rhetoric that fascist movements have always employed to redirect rage away from actual perpetrators of violence and toward democratic institutions and processes. When Trump says 27,000 soldiers died last month, that's what I want to see stopped, while simultaneously pushing a peace plan that would reward Russian aggression and guarantee future Ukrainian suffering. He is engaged in what Orwell called doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs simultaneously and accept both of them. He wants you to believe he cares about soldiers dying, while also believing that Ukraine must surrender territory and limit its military and abandon NATO aspirations, as if somehow capitulating to Putin's demands will stop Putin from further aggression, when literally every historical example of appeasing fascist powers tells us that appeasement only emboldens further conquest. Neville Chamberlain waving his piece of paper and declaring peace for our time after handing Czechoslovakia to Hitler is not some quaint historical anecdote. It is a direct parallel to what Trump is attempting with Ukraine, and anyone with even a passing familiarity with 20th century history should be able to recognize the catastrophic folly of this approach. The progressive movement must resist the temptation toward both knee-jerk anti-Americanism that leads some on the left to sympathize with Russian imperialism simply because it opposes American power, and also resist the centrist militarism that treats any criticism of American foreign policy as treasonous weakness. The coherent progressive position is that we oppose imperialism in all its forms, whether American or Russian, but we recognize that in this specific conflict, Ukraine is fighting a defensive war against fascist aggression and deserves support in that struggle, not because Ukrainian nationalism is somehow more virtuous than Russian nationalism, but because the principle of self-determination is foundational to international justice and because fascism must be opposed wherever it appears. When Trump minimizes civilian casualties and inflates military deaths, and claims the war would never have happened if only he were president and pushes a peace plan that demands Ukrainian surrender, he is not offering an alternative vision of conflict resolution. He is actively aiding and abetting Russian fascism, and we must name this clearly and unambiguously. But the domestic implications are equally terrifying, because Trump's Ukraine position is inseparable from his broader assault on democratic institutions and truth itself. Trump's comments followed a meeting between Ukrainian officials and U.S. negotiators in Florida, where Zelensky's chief negotiator pushed for changes to a White House peace plan widely considered favorable to Russia, with Trump telling reporters that Zelensky's people love the U.S. peace plan and that Russia's fine with it, before saying "I'm not sure that Zelensky is fine with it," and claiming he was disappointed. Zelensky had not read the proposals as of a few hours ago, which is classic Trumpian gaslighting, where he manufactures disagreement and positions himself as the reasonable party while actually the one making unreasonable demands. The fact that he claims Russia is fine with his peace plan should tell you everything you need to know about whose interest this plan actually serves, because Russia has spent 3 years trying to conquer Ukraine and murder its leadership and erase its national identity. So if Russia is suddenly fine with Trump's plan, it means the plan gives Russia most of what it wants. And this is where I need you to connect all these threads into a comprehensive understanding of the authoritarian movement that Trump leads and the existential threat it poses to democratic governance. Trump's position on Ukraine, his minimization of civilian casualties, his inflation of military deaths, his claims that the war would never have happened if the election weren't rigged, his peace plan that demands Ukrainian capitulation, his national security strategy that echoes white nationalist talking points and receives praise from the Kremlin, his undermining of NATO alliances and democratic solidarity, all of this is part of the same fascist project that animated the January 6th insurrection and the Muslim ban and the child separation policy and the attempts to overturn election results and the assault on reproductive rights and the demonization of trans people and the book bans and the attacks on critical race theory and every other manifestation of right-wing authoritarianism that has accelerated since Trump descended that golden escalator in 2015. The reason Trump blames the rigged election for Ukraine's bloodbath is because undermining faith in democratic processes is central to the fascist playbook, because if people believe elections are rigged, then they will accept authoritarian rule as necessary to restore order. And if they believe Trump alone can prevent wars through his personal relationship with dictators, then they will accept his concentration of power and rejection of constitutional constraints. This is how democracies die, not through military coups but through the gradual erosion of democratic norms and the elevation of strongman leadership and the cultivation of an alternative reality where objective facts matter less than tribal loyalty and conspiratorial thinking. Trump's Ukraine rhetoric is not some separate issue from his election lies. They are two manifestations of the same authoritarian impulse to reject reality in favor of a narrative that serves his accumulation of power. So when you watch this clip and you hear Trump droning on about javelins versus sheets and minimizing civilian casualties and claiming 27,000 soldiers died last month and declaring the war would never have happened if the election weren't rigged, understand that you are witnessing a masterclass in authoritarian rhetoric, the weaponization of human suffering in service of power consolidation, the manufacturing of alternative realities to justify morally indefensible positions, and the corruption of peace discourse to advance the interests of fascism. This is what we are fighting against. This is why every election matters. This is why we cannot afford cynicism or apathy, or false equivalencies between flawed liberalism and actual fascism. Trump is not offering a different approach to foreign policy. He is actively collaborating with authoritarian power to undermine democratic solidarity and normalize the conquest of sovereign nations, and we must oppose this with every tool at our disposal, because the stakes are quite literally the survival of democratic governance and international order, and anyone who tells you these are abstract concerns disconnected from material conditions should be reminded that Ukraine's children are being bombed in their schools, while Trump minimizes their deaths as a few people from the dropping of a missile in the middle of Kiev or wherever, because to Trump they are abstractions, disposable extras in his narcissistic drama of deal-making and strongman posturing, but to anyone with a functioning conscience, they are human beings whose suffering demands justice and solidarity, not cynical manipulation in service of authoritarian power.